it used to be part of a state youth.
Youth development.
It was. It separated. It broke off. I believe.
Well, it's a new building, but the same function. And I'm the treatment coordinator and clinician also in one of the programs that I help design and work in. I actually do clinical work in it, but I manage a building that houses intermediate and high-end delinquents. I've been in juvenile justice for about 30 years, and I worked in mental health before for 10 years, basically in the streets and emergency services and whatnot. So, had my share of seeing and experiencing and understanding trauma, because in the environment where we work with, it comes at you from all angles, at all angles. And the thing is, it's some that oftentimes you don't even know it's there.
Chief Osgood, I suspect you could probably say the same about yourself and your police force, that it's probably a very unpredictable atmosphere that we live in today. And you guys and the firefighters are really kind of in the front lines of things that maybe make headlines in the next day's newspaper.
That's right, and I think during the film I interviewed Chief Ramsey out of, he's the commissioner or the chief of police in Philadelphia, and he made the comment that police officers make decisions in fractions of a second, and a lot of their decisions that they make are analyzed for months and months and years, and certainly those types of decisions that police officers are making day in and day out are stressful.
And it's been painful to see instances when police have, in the course of doing their job, have sometimes have to resort to doing things that have put them really in a spotlight that is unfavorable.
Correct.
I can't think of another time, at least from my memory, when police have been under such scrutiny. Is that a kind of a fair thing to?
It really has been. I think that police. I've been doing this for almost 27 years, but I remember the Rodney King incident in Los Angeles in the early 90s. That police were really scrutinized at that time in history. But I think that what's happened, especially since Ferguson, the incident in Ferguson, and then New York, and then Baltimore, and now we have another one in Chicago. But over the past year or so, it's much worse today, the scrutiny, than it was back in the early 90s, for sure.
Andrea, you're in a different area here, and I would like to think, for the most part, it's perhaps a happier area. Is that?
Yeah. So I've been a nurse on maternity or the family place at Concord Hospital for 12 years, and you're absolutely right. Probably 98.2% of the time, it's all happy and people are having their babies and everything is great. But the other percentage of the time, it can be fairly traumatic for the family, and when you're there taking care of families where things don't go as planned, it can be traumatic for the people at the bedside too. And I think this movie really sums up, I think, all of our professions in that we feel that.
Did you folks find this to be effective? Do you think that, or was it just surface? Or did you think they dug deep enough to make people who may not be really, and I'll use the word aware of what kind of problems caregivers discover, fall into, have to deal with?
I think
Did the movie work?
it covers a lot with people who work with people. You know, and a lot of times, is what I can see here, you absorb other people's problems, emotions, and whatnot, and kind of put yours aside so you can be able to deal with what they're presenting in front of you. And I think the way they did the presentation is it cut across all boundaries. It was really about people working with people and the difficulties it has. So it didn't matter where you worked, it mattered that you were working with folks. And I know professionally, I see it around me all the time. The caregivers are usually the last ones to know there's a problem. And we who work in it will see it, but they can't see it. And sometimes, and I understand because I went through the same thing. It's like we were invulnerable, and when they said, you begin and you're gonna save the world, everybody begins there. And then little by little, you find you can't, and you get discouraged, and then it's like, it goes on and on and on, so.
Within the environments that the folks work, are there structures or policies that might assist those that you feel are under undue stress or coming out of situations that you probably would assume that they might need some sort of, if nothing else, just the ability to talk about what they've had to deal with?
Well, certainly in the law enforcement industry, there is a framework for that. We go through like a flow chart, if you will, if we have a critical incident and we see the need to get people help. But going back to your earlier question too, I think that this film really brings up this awareness of what first responders or caregivers go through. And it reminds me of an incident just not too long ago out in San Bernardino, California. And I think that when you watch the news and you watch that from the comfort of your home, and you see all of those first responders and the carnage, if you will, of what they saw when they went into that building, that's very traumatic. But they didn't have time to really absorb it too much because they were on another mission to go find the people that were responsible for that. And so the days following San Bernardino, it was all about, pipe bombs and terrorism, but never once was there any, that I saw, anything in the media about what they just went through, the first responders.
Yes.
And that's the world we live in.
Well, in that particular instance, I think the moment that sticks out in my mind is when there was the effort to get people out of the building, and there was concern as to whether or not the perpetrators were still active in the building. And one, I believe it was a policeman, said to the group that he was leading down a corridor, "I'll take a bullet for you," or words to that effect. I mean, this, what more could you ask from somebody who is trying to help you in a situation where indeed you might turn a corner and confront somebody who would take your life in a heartbeat? I don't know if these gentlemen can hear us. Rodney?
Yes, I can hear you.
Uh,
I can hear you, but it's not as clear as I thought it could be.
Okay. I'm not quite sure how we can remedy that. This is it's kind of an awkward situation in that we have people facing the screen so they can see you, and we have three panelists here who are looking to their right in order to see you, but also have to face the audience that's looking at you.
It's getting better there.
The technology is great, but it does have its limitations as to how it can manipulate the situation that we find ourselves in.
We're glad to be with you tonight, and just picking up on the last statement, one of the reasons we created this film is because there seems to be such a kind of blind spot in our media in terms of the real backstory. That is the story of how the medics, the hospice people, the doctors, the nurses, the child welfare people, how they are personally affected. The emphasis obviously is on the victim and on the primary trauma, but the story of secondary trauma goes pretty much uncovered. And so we felt that it was really important to get that story out to people, and we're very honored that each of you is present here tonight and eager to hear your comments and your questions.
Yes. Well, I'll ask a question immediately. Over what period of time did it take you to photograph this? And I guess, was there resistance on the part of those who you were interviewing to tell you about their stress?
Well, the whole period of making the film was about 5 years, much longer than one might expect it to take. But it's a very involved process, as you can imagine. And sometimes people have wonderful stories, but they don't know how to tell them. And so part of what we did was largely through word of mouth, began to talk to people and be referred to other people that not only had powerful stories, but were able to share them. And so the interviewing process itself was a very powerful experience. Sometimes we did it on site in the locations where people worked. Sometimes they came into the studio. But we're very, very pleased with the people that we were able to interview. I will say, without making any identification, that yes, sometimes there is a certain resistance. Let me call it. As professionals, sometimes we are trained to have a certain image that we present to the public, and while I know that there are doctors who are willing to be vulnerable, it was somewhat challenging with the doctors that we interviewed, not because they don't understand secondary trauma, not because we didn't get good interviews, but the real question is whether the interviewee will indeed make herself or himself vulnerable. And I think the individuals that we selected and that you saw in the film tonight, by and large, were very willing to do that, and that's what makes the film, I think, emotional and we hope having an impact. Rodney, do you want to add something to that?
I would just say that, yeah, I think the people who we did select to put in the film were pretty open and also very receptive, and also had a sense that this story that we were telling was important.
Folks, do you have a question of these gentlemen? And Rodney, you're a producer and also the composer of the music
Yes,
that
yeah.
accompanies the film. And I've always referred to you as Vic, so that John is throwing me, Mr. Compher. Vic Compher is the director of the documentary. Have you a question to pose to these folks? And I will introduce the three panelists. There's
Yes, please.
Norm Larochelle is involved with youth that are in a detention situation. Concord's chief of police, Bradley Osgood, I think that's probably, that doesn't need too much description as to what he's involved with. And the third is a young lady by the name of Andrea Fitzgerald, who's a registered nurse at the Concord Hospital and pretty much works in the baby division there at the hospital. I thought we had three rather divergent people to express just exactly how their aspect of caregiving indeed affects the population and how the population affect them.
Well, that's great.
Yes?
So honored to have the participation of Police Commissioner Charles H. Ramsey, who, as you probably know, was also Obama's choice as the co-chair of the Task Force for 21st Century Policing. And it was so impressive, the degree to which he was able to be vulnerable and talk about the human side of policing. We don't get that story very much. What we get, obviously, are the challenges to things like police brutality and other issues, and a lot of public media cry for accountability, and certainly those things are important, and I think Officer Ramsey would acknowledge that they are important. But the story we don't hear about is the incredible risks that the officers take, the fact that some 18% of many police forces are suffering from PTSD, which can create a reactionary behavior that Officer Ramsey has also talked about. Many others have secondary trauma. So all of this can also affect performance, and it's not just true of the police force, but firefighters, medics, hospice people, child protective workers. Some 37% of child protective workers will have a serious incident of secondary trauma at some point in their careers. And what we want the public to begin to realize is that this is normal. This doesn't mean that these people are bad professionals. It just means that they are affected in very profound ways, often by the work that they do, and that we need, as organizations and as a general public, to find mechanisms and ways of supporting them through the difficult challenges of their work.
Yes. What I'd like to try to do is get the audience that we have here engaged in a conversation. I would like to hope that they have a question that they might want to ask one of you five folks. Indeed, is there a question that you would like to pose to either these folks or the ones that are up on the screen here? Anything?
I'd like to make a comment, not so much a question.
Oh, sure.
I've been a nurse for many years, worked in many different environments, and I just felt myself feeling everything that these workers were feeling. It was very intense, but it was very, very good, and it helped me think some of the things that I have seen, but it just is a real eye-opener, and I wish everyone would be able to see this movie because it's very, very strong.
Well, candidly, that's, I was probably one of the first people to see it here on these premises, and I felt the same way. And I felt that the messages and the sentiments that were being expressed by people in Philadelphia were, as I said, I guess earlier, universal. And that if you in Concord, New Hampshire, or Manchester, or any other place in this country where there are similar occupations, there would be similar feelings. And perhaps, as you just stated, the appreciation of hearing the fact that indeed they do exist elsewhere, and have, if there is some consolation to sometimes the stress, the fact that you're not alone in how you feel about some of the occupational situations that you find yourself in. Anything else that you folks would like to add here to?
Well, I think we were talking before you came on Skype, I guess, but you had a bunch of statistics, or the percent or high degree of alcoholism, divorce, and I think in law enforcement in our culture, and it's not necessarily just here in New Hampshire, but I think it's in law enforcement throughout the country. I think police officers know, they hear that alcoholism is high, divorce rates are high. One of the bigger issues in policing right now is suicide rates in law enforcement. But police officers know that, and I still believe that in that culture, there's not a courage that exists for them to talk about it in our culture yet. And I'm glad, and I really like the film, and I'm glad that you produced it, and I think you did a fantastic job. And I think that it sends a message to just the general audience that these are some real issues that first responders and caregivers face, but we know that, but we don't do enough to do anything about it. That's unfortunate.
Well, I appreciate your acknowledgement of that, and the comment also of the woman in the audience before that. We hope that you will assist us in getting the word out about this film, whether you can invite people to the additional screenings that are happening either this week, whether you have connections with your professional associations and conferences, maybe opportunities in the training programs. There are certainly examples where organizations are beginning progressively to address these things. We try to give you a little taste of 4 of those examples in the film. The stress first aid program in the Philadelphia Police Department, in the Philadelphia Fire Department, which I know exists also in some of the other public service organizations. The sanctuary model that Dr. Sandra Bloom has created, which is in many different social service settings. The examples sometimes of hospices is quite impressive in terms of the way they do their rounds and their bereavement sessions, the acknowledgement of the death and loss that comes with that job. The special seminars, we showed one by Laura Krawcheck, When Helping Hurts. So it's not that there aren't these mechanisms. They do exist. They're beginning, I believe, to become more recognized, and I hope somewhat more common. And I believe that indeed in the police department there are some programs that are beginning to develop. I've heard reference to them. They're not actually in the film, but there is a growing awareness. There are 2 other films, by the way, dealing with police that I think are quite impressive. One of them you can Google. It's called Code 9 Officer in Need of Assistance, and it's about the PTSD in the police department, and it's produced by a woman in Florida named Deborah Ortiz. I would really recommend that one. And another one produced here in Philadelphia is called Blue, about the officers in blue, and it's about the significant occurrence of suicide in the police department. Both of them I would recommend, of course, along with their own, in terms of educating the public and helping to create awareness within the police departments.
Rodney, I have a question for you. A little bit on the lighter side. How tough is it to score a documentary like this, where you have feelings being expressed and sometimes music can help, and sometimes it can be an intrusion into the words that are being said. Tell me about how you came about doing that.
I've been a composer for film and television longer than I've been a producer of film and television. So, I love doing documentaries, so I have a significant amount of experience doing it. But particularly with this film, it was in some ways easier for me because of being the producer of the film and being so close to the footage and so close to what Vic was doing, and our team, Mike Adamo and Tim Fright, who are the editor and the animator. By the time it was time for me to score the film, I had seen it so many times and knew it so intimately. I had a really strong sense of kind of what the music should be. I have to say, in some ways, scoring this film was the easiest thing I did. It was probably the easiest part of making of being part of the team of making it. And to answer your question, it is a challenge to figure out how to write music that sort of touches on the emotional aspect of the film, but also keeps it going, keeps the motion happening, and doesn't step on the dialogue. And one of the ways I chose to do that was just by just picking, with the exception of a few cues, it's just piano and cello is most of the score. And worked with a really amazing young cellist who's studying at Temple University and also works with one of the principal cellists in the Philadelphia Orchestra. Udibar David is the cellist in the orchestra, and is one of his students who actually played the cello parts. His name was Ajibola Rivers, and he is amazing. He's an amazing cellist and a pleasure to work with. But it was just picking like basically two instruments for most of the cues in the film, and just kind of finding this simple motif that I kind of played around in different ways depending on the character of the person who was speaking.
I thought you did an effective job. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
I think that Rodney also deserves some credit. You mentioned the lightness, how to create lightness, because the subject is admittedly pretty dark, pretty heavy topic, and part of the challenge for us artistically was to find not only in the music, but in the animation, and then with the touches of humor that came in at several points there toward the end, some ways to sort of, we hope, lift the audience and also to inspire the audience through the presentation of compassion, satisfaction, the statements of the professionals where they talked about the great meaning and purpose they found in their work, the honor that they had working with vulnerable people. So part of our objective artistically as well as messaging has been to create some balance there so that some of that lightness also comes through, and we hope that we were successful in doing that.
Yes.
I wanted to, you had mentioned, what I was thinking about is the film actually covered a lot of what I would call ongoing responders. And these are people that are in a situation constant, and it doesn't seem to end. And then what I mean is, our facility, we're tasked with habilitating or rehabilitating, actually treating kids who were adjudicated delinquents. And in other words, they had committed some criminal crimes, and we had to treat them. And in order to treat them, they're coming in with a whole negative view of the world. And we have to represent the positive view of the world. And the trauma is when the two get together, it's very difficult to not absorb the negativity and to not, take any of that home with us. Mm-hmm. What I find, especially with us, the long-term effects of that is we notice a higher incidence of heart conditions, mm-hmm. higher incidence of diabetes especially, stress, depression, drugs, etc., etc. but very slowly and very gradual. And you'll first notice it with the rates of sick calls, and you'll notice it with the rates of accidents, and whatnot. And these people are in a negative environment day in and day out. And we look at behaviors that we would see as inhuman in the community, and we have to try to humanize it for people that don't understand that. And I see that as a heavy trauma for folks trying to work it and trying to stay objective and detached from all of the emotions that comes in with it. Because these kids also bring in a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulties, and it's all in front. And they're in there 10-hour days, day in, day out, and you know, the support is just through the camaraderie. And your film just hit.
There is a real cumulative effect to that kind of exposure. You may be okay for the first 6 months or the first year on the job, but it does begin to wear down the spirit and the stamina unless an organization is able, and this is not easily done, but is able to find certain mechanisms that restore the spirit of the people working there. And I don't mean to speak simplistically about that. There are programs such as the sanctuary model that were referred to Sandra Bloom having created that, where we are getting testimonials from some organizations that are beginning to use an approach called trauma-focused intervention. This being a film audience, I think you'd want to know about a recent film that was produced by Jamie Redford called Paper Tigers, and it focuses on a disciplinary, quote-unquote, disciplinary school in Washington State where all the kids that were sent there were the quote-unquote troublemakers, and where the faculty just really felt a tremendous burden. And that's not exactly what you're talking about, because I think you're talking about inpatient, which is probably even more challenging. But the Paper Tigers is a film that you might want to consider bringing to your theater there, which indeed shows how a real transformative process can happen, particularly with the students, as it addresses not the question of what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. It's a reframing of the approach, which, with some layers of supportiveness, it begins to depict how the children are being heard in a new and different way, and the results are quite extraordinary. Now, in all fairness, too, I'm told that faculty in that particular film did not have, I talked, in fact, to the principal in that school for quite a long time, and they acknowledged that they did not have enough built in for their own staff. Even though they were having some success with the kids, they had not advanced to the point where they were taking care of themselves well enough. But those kinds of technologies are developing, and again, sanctuary model being one of those. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ACEs task force. The studies done by Filetti and Robert Anda are showing the powerful impact of trauma as the root cause of much of the acting out and disturbance of the kids. And there's quite a movement happening now around the country for teachers, for social workers, for others working with very troubled young people that uses these trauma-focused interventions. And again, that's kind of what Paper Tigers is about. And we are the parallel level of that, which then looks at, well, what is the impact upon the teachers, upon the social workers, and so forth? How do we try to help ourselves as helpers?
Andrea, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation here a little bit. you mentioned initially that in your line of work, it's primarily a happy situation.
That's right.
Is it possible to say that because of the fact that it is normally a happy situation, when things go bad, when incidents happen that are very dramatic, does it have a stronger impact on the people because of the fact that they're not used to it happen? Unlike a policeman or unlike a person who is dealing with conflicting situations practically all the time.
Well, I think that we're trained for emergencies and so forth, but yes, I think you're right in saying that most of our normal day in, day out job is pretty great and happy, and you're involved in people's moments in their lives that are pretty significant, and that is a happy moment. And when it is not happy, while we're trained in dealing with the event of whatever it is, I do think that you remember that event more specifically than you do the 12 other happy events you had in that month, per se. And that's just the thorn that kind of sticks in you sometimes. And I think that you guys made that clear in your film.
Yeah.
Do you work in a neonatal situation? I didn't hear all the introduction.
I work in labor and delivery, and
Okay.
at Concord Hospital we have a special care nursery, like level 2, not like a NICU, but of course in our culture now we have more sick people than we ever did. So with that comes some baggage sometimes.
So you could identify with Ann Coyle in the movie, the neonatal nurse, I expect, in certain
Oh
ways.
yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Sorry.
So I have a question or a comment. I started out many years ago as a neonatal crisis intervention specialist, which meant I counseled people who were in the neonatal crisis at the time, either infant death or stillborn, or the babies were born with some kind of congenital disorders and things along those lines, and went on to get my doctorate and then have been a therapist. Now I'm a college professor, and I was watching your film very intently because I know many of those situations. I've been in many of those situations, and I teach undergraduates, about being a therapist, those who want to become therapists. And just last week, I told the students that are my upper level students in abnormal psychology, that I gave them all a copy of the compassion fatigue test, and said, obviously this won't mean anything to you now, but please keep it, because as you go into this profession, you'll want to check yourself every once in a while to see if you're really doing as well as you think you are. And made it very clear early on, this is a profession where you do have problems and you do need to step back, because you can't carry it all the time. So I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for doing that, because I think that's one of the things that we don't always tell people. And you did say that, you're not going to learn this in graduate. Well, my kids are getting it, my students are getting it in undergrad, but because I've been there, done that. And it's really important that they know that. And you did a fabulous job with bringing that across, and I hope that more people have the opportunity to actually hear that. I wish this wasn't, our semester ended last week, we're just doing finals now. Otherwise I'd have all my students here, because I think this is really important. And I think
Well, I
it's
commend
important
you for doing that, for being proactive with your students, for helping them to administer the self-administering test of the ProQual, I think you're talking about, which helps people about self-evaluate their own level of compassion fatigue. I think so many, particularly young and rather naive students, like the children in the film that wanted to be a cop, even at an older age, you want to be a helper, you want to be a social worker, a nurse, whatever, and there's this idealism which on the one hand is wonderful, but sometimes it kind of blinds the individual from the darker side of the work. And it takes courage, as I think you're exemplifying, to try to help your students have a more well-rounded view. Sometimes it's hard to break through that, though. They're not ready to hear that at the beginning stage, but as they begin to get their feet wet through their practicums and other ways, sometimes they become more receptive to that.
I would add too, if maybe when school's back in session, you have your next class, maybe you could organize a screening. We have educational versions of the film available on our website and through our distributor.
It's good to know. Thank you.
Folks, we've been here for about 45 minutes. I'd like to keep it to the point where you don't feel like we're wearing out our welcome here. Is there anything that you folks as panelists would like to say as a final sentiment here tonight? I agree with Vic, and we have been somewhat disappointed in the turnout for the film here. For whatever reason, it just hasn't struck a nerve, and he suggested that perhaps if you left here tonight feeling that you have experienced something that you would like others to watch, there's still opportunity to do so for the next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And not hopefully sounding mercenary, I'd appreciate you doing it. Any other questions or comments or whatever you'd like to add here, folks? But Vic and Rodney, I think at 45 or 50 minutes, I think we've done a decent job of discussing your film, and I do hope that the viewership of it will improve in the next couple of days because of what we have done here this evening.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be part of the conversation, and we invite people to visit our website at www.caregiversfilm.com for lots more information.
Okay.
And I just want to extend a thank you to the people who've come as panelists. We really appreciate you being here, and thank you for having the film, and thank you everybody who came out.
Thank you. Rodney, Vic, thanks a lot.
All right. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thanks for coming, folks. Again, I hope you found it something